Well, I remember meeting her because I was like fangirling up from afar. I saw Elizabeth speak at Ray Snape's CamZ Fest a couple of years ago, and she was absolutely brilliant. So when I knew we were doing something around PE, I thought I've got to get Elizabeth on here to speak. So I'm absolutely delighted that she's able to join us today. And I'm not only that, but I'm absolutely delighted we've managed to kind of circumnavigate the tech to get you here as well. There've been one or two glitches backstage, so she's kind of screeching in to start this session. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining us. I shan't kind of steal your thunder and do a big long explanation because you can tell everybody how fabulous you are. Penny can kind of take me off and pop you in. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Emma. I do remember you. I'm much better with faces than names. That's the thing. But yes, slight issues with the tech because I have about 10,000 emails and they just weren't all matching up with joining to present today. Plus the fact that I've never used Microsoft Teams before in my life. So for people that, you know, you'd think in this year with the pandemic that I'd be a whiz with all the technology, but no, only Zoom and Google Meet and all that stuff, not Microsoft Teams. So hopefully, okay, I don't know if I'm going to be able to share my screen. I'm not sure how to do that.
Okay.
But
Elizabeth, in the top right-hand corner, have you got a little box with an arrow pointing up? Yeah, click on that. That's your share screen button. And then then that'll show in my producer screen here.
Okay.
And then I'll to add it in. There's a bit of a 20-second delay though for that.
Okay, that's good to know because yeah, the tech is kind of like at the moment, but fingers crossed, everyone. I hope everyone's okay. I feel like I should just chat on while we're waiting for the tech to work, and I can do a brief introduction of myself while we're waiting, and hopefully it will work. But yes, Emma introduced me as Elizabeth Wright. Most people call me Liz. I'm sure you can tell by the accent I'm Australian, and I was a Paralympic swimmer for Australia many moons ago, and I will touch on that lightly in my talk. But I was born with a physical disability called congenital limb deficiency, and so I was essentially born with missing limbs, and I prefer to say that I'm limb different because I certainly don't see my missing limbs as making me deficient in any way. So I refer to my disability as limb difference. Essentially, I'm missing half my right arm. I'm also missing a bone in the forearm of my left arm, and I'm missing a finger on my left hand, and my thumb and one of my fingers is joined together. And I'm also missing half my right leg, which means that I have to wear a prosthetic leg to be able to walk and have mobility. And for me, growing up, it was definitely a very interesting time because I was born in 1979, which was kind of this cusp of time between where a lot of disabled people were still kind of being put into homes, or this automatic assumption that they would be sent to a special ed school, and also a time where actually disability civil rights were really taking off in many countries, including the UK, the US and Australia. So there's kind of this strange friction at the time that I was born around disability, and there's a lot of friction there that is still kind of apparent today, which I'll get onto as I talk more or get more into my talk. So for me, that friction really expressed itself in the way that my parents kind of really fought to get me into mainstream primary school. The New South Wales Education Department wanted to send me to a special ed school kind of in the next suburb, and my parents really didn't want to do that. They wanted to send me to the school that they'd sent my older brother and sister to, because they recognised for them and for myself that it would be better placed for me perhaps to go to a mainstream primary school so that I could learn to navigate a very non-disabled world that that we kind of live in. And it was kind of interesting because for me growing up, I come from a very active family. I mean, in Australia, we had a pool in the backyard. We had a really big backyard that, you know, I basically used to love riding my trike and kind of setting up obstacle courses and doing obstacle courses and things like that. So we're a very active family, and it made kind of going into I just want to see, is it going to work? Or
I can't see it, so the screen, it's not come through on my screen. So try clicking the upward arrow again, and then okay. And share screen.
Okay, if it doesn't work, that's fine. I can just keep on talking. I'm sure you guys won't mind. I might just keep on doing that anyway. So I won't worry about sharing the screen. You'll just have to look at my beautiful, lovely face instead. Yeah, so for me, going to primary school, what I really wanted, or what was a real focus for me, was actually being able to take part in sport as a physically disabled child at a mainstream school, and I was the only child with a physical disability at my school. So I think in some way I was a real conundrum for the teachers. They'd not had to think about making adaptations before, or thinking about getting, equipment in, or how I would access spaces and stuff like that. So when I look back, I can kind of see that there tended to be this kind of apathy towards my interest in being active and playing sport. Certainly doesn't mean that it was kind of common that I would be excluded from sport. I remember in infant school that I wanted to take part in the athletics day, and the teachers were happy for me to do that. And so I took part in a running race, even though I can't run to save my life. And I fell over at the end of the race, which was completely normal and natural for me because the nature of my prosthetic and my disability, I tend to fall over a lot. But it was, and I came last. But the point was that I was just happy that I was able to take part with my peers. But like I said, there did tend to be this kind of apathy and lack of imagination about the sports that I could participate in, or the sports that I might be interested in participating in. So for me, my journey through kind of primary school was very much about me self-advocating for my participation in sport. And this self-advocation really kind of expressed itself by the time I made it to year 4, where a lot of my friends were wanting to try out for the school netball team, and I desperately wanted to try out for the school netball team, even though I'm really not a ball person at all. Ball games, even now, I'm in my 40s, and even now, throw a ball at my head, I'm going to duck, right? And all of this actually comes back from school sport, where one year we were playing softball, and I was fielding because that's where the teachers always placed me, and I got donked on the head by the softball. So I've always been a bit not great with ball games, but I wanted to try out for netball, and I went to Mr. Pers, who is our sports teacher, and I asked him, this was the first time that I'd really approached a teacher about trying out for an actual school team sport, and he seemed quite surprised that I would want to do this, and a bit confused, I think, and but in the end he was like, okay, you can try out if you want. So I did. I went and tried out. I didn't make the team, but every time someone threw the ball at me, I ducked. So of course I wasn't going to make the team, which in the end, I was okay with. But the point was, it was about that sense of inclusion and the support from teachers and staff for me to at least attempt or try to kind of try out for this team. And I think in that moment, it gave me a certain level of confidence. And I think that this is what, when it comes to sport and disability, it's about instilling a sense of confidence in the student about their abilities and also their opportunities to actually play sport and at least be involved in some way with sport. For me, this kind of confidence then kind of expressed itself in year 6, when I decided that for the first year I wanted to compete in the school swimming gala. And again, the teachers were a bit apathetic about it, a bit surprised, a bit confused. I think I just confused my teachers a lot. But in the end, they agreed that I could swim in the 50-meter breaststroke race. And in this race, I was one of 2 girls, because I was one of the oldest students or pupils in my year. I was one of 2 girls who were in the 12 years age and plus. And so they were racing us against the boys that were in that same year group, which almost made me pull out of the race, but I stuck to my guns and I swam this race. And the thing is, I came first in the race. And if I had been racing the boys, I would have actually come 3rd out of the 5 boys. So for me, I think, especially with disability and sport, is it's not kind of making this assumption about a person's or student's or a child's disability and actually what their ability is. For me, what I hope I'm illustrating is that I was very aware of my strengths and how this could potentially play out, and I was willing to take that risk to actually attempt the sport. Like I said, you know, there were other moments which maybe didn't kind of roll up quite that well. You know, we had a lot of kind of really good cross-country kids in my year, and cross-country was kind of one of the big sporting highlights in both my primary and high school. And I was always given the option of either doing the cross-country or sitting there and being the person at the desk at the finish line to kind of clock who was coming first, second and third. And because I was given this choice, it would depend on each year how lazy I was feeling, essentially, as to whether I would take part. So some years I decided that actually I want to walk the cross country with my friends. I want to feel that sense of inclusion. And then other years I just really couldn't be bothered. I didn't want to do the cross country, and I was given an easy out not to do it. Which I don't think that was quite necessarily a good thing to do. But that was what the teachers were kind of managing the situation with at that time. But I think for me, as a disabled pupil and student, the important thing that sport really gave to me in this context was confidence. And I think it's something we have to think about, is the kind of acknowledged benefits of what sport actually gives any one of us. And that is, increased self-esteem and confidence and well-being. We know that being active and playing sport can be really positive for our mental health. It also allows us to be more inclusive and practice our social skills. It helps us, be quite successful academically as well. Sport can also be actually a really huge benefit for disabled pupils and people in general. For me, with my disability, I have to really look after my core strength because my balance isn't the best. So for me, being active is really quite important because it means that I'm able to keep my balance better and keep my strength better. And the older I get, the more important it is that I look after my physical health and make sure that I'm fit and healthy. And when you start sport young, it instills those good habits for life. So, it's again coming back to this idea of being aware of a pupil's disability and not making assumptions about what they can or can't do, because actually sport could be a really useful tool in managing their impairment or conditions, whatever they may be. But I just wanted to address some of the barriers that we face, and I kind of caught the end of Alistair's chat, and he was kind of touching on some of these as well. So, but this is certainly from my perspective as having been a disabled student. But common barriers include lack of access. So for me, you know, there were some sports that we didn't necessarily have the correct tools or equipment for me to be able to participate. But it's not just equipment, it's also about access to sports spaces. So whether it's an oval or a hall or a playground, making sure that there is access, say via ramps or handrails, etc., into those spaces. But as well, thinking bigger than that, because sport quite often isn't just about the actual playing of the sport, but it's also the additional things outside of that, such as changing rooms. So are your changing rooms and toilets accessible? So it's kind of that, just thinking of all of these things that you might not necessarily have thought about before. Another barrier, which I have touched on already, is myths and stereotypes around disability. So, of course, you know, some of the most obvious myths and stereotypes are around ability. And I think for a lot of teachers, there can be a lot of worry about possibly causing injury to a child or pain in some way. But again, it's about letting the child and or the parents lead on what that child is actually physically capable of doing within the context of that particular sport. But another thing I want to point out, because a lot of the time with disability, especially after the London Paralympics, there became this real rhetoric in society, which the disability community were really aware of, that if you're disabled, you're either a Paralympian or you're unemployed or something like that. It was kind of this very awful rhetoric that was going around. And the point I want to make here, and that I kind of say to a lot of people, is that if you're disabled and you want to play sport or be physically active, it doesn't always then necessarily mean that you want to become a Paralympian. You know, certainly it was that way in my case with swimming. But the easiest way I tell people to actually remember this is that there are non-disabled people who love sport but have no intention of becoming an Olympian. It's the same in the disability community. There are disabled people who love sport and love being active, but they have no intention of becoming a Paralympian. So that's kind of another myth and stereotype that can impact the way that disabled people engage in sport. I think as well, that can also be another barrier, can also be a lack of specialised coaching or programs out there. And on my slides, I did have some websites to direct you to help with supporting perhaps in increasing your skills and training around disability sport, which I will share with Emma, and she'll then hopefully be able to send them out to you. But I think that there can be a bit of a lack in terms of training, but what I would encourage you to do is to definitely investigate that and look at upping your skills around that. So I kind of said at the start that, you know, going back way in time to when I was born and going to school, you know, I felt that there was this strange friction between society, and I certainly experienced that in school, because teachers at that point hadn't necessarily, in mainstream schools, hadn't necessarily experienced or worked with a disabled child. But I tend to see in this day and age as well that there's still those frictions, not as bad anymore, but I still have instances where I go into schools where I might be speaking and, you know, I ask them, do you have any disabled children in this school? And sometimes it's a no, and sometimes it's a, oh, we have a few, but they kind of work in that classroom, or we might have one or two with physical disabilities. Kind of, you know, dotted around, you might say. For me, a few years ago, I did a TEDx talk, where I spoke about a young girl called Emily, who I had met at a school up here in Yorkshire. And she was limb different like myself. And she was really struggling at school because, again, I think there was this sense of not just apathy, but also a kind of non-helpful way of wrapping her in cotton wool. It was this worry and this fear about that she might hurt herself if she takes part in certain activities, including sporting activities. And so she was kind of gently held back from participating in sport, and amongst other things. And this was kind of a real concern for her because she believed that she couldn't achieve anything in life. And after she heard my talk, she decided that she wanted to be a Paralympic swimmer. And she even dressed up for a dress-up day for school as a Paralympic swimmer after she'd heard me speak. And this really heartened me because to me, it was that that wish, that desire that disabled children have to just be included in every aspect of schooling, including sport. And for me, you know, going into high school, it was a similar situation. Even with me being a Paralympic swimmer, by this stage, I had to self-advocate. And I kind of feel like the Emilys in this world, the Liz's of this world, me, sometimes we do have to self-advocate in situations where maybe we shouldn't have to self-advocate. So my wish kind of for disabled children, especially in mainstream schools, is that teachers work with them to find those solutions to being able to fully participate in sport as best they can. And for me, that is kind of the summing up of my message. I think there's always a desire to take part. And I certainly know that when disabled children do take part in sport, their confidence and self-esteem grow and they thrive and flourish more. But it's also the social aspect as well. And just that feeling that you are being seen and you are being heard and you are being included in sport. So that's me without the slides. I hope that you enjoyed my talk and my wonderful face.
It was lovely, Liz.
I will pass, Emma, I'll pass the links that I have onto you so that you can pass them on to everyone else.
Thank you so much. I remember hearing you speak at CamZ, and you were telling this story about hotels and about how the hotels would say that they were accessible. But then you couldn't get into the conference room to actually deliver the keynote. And I just think it was such a brilliant point that you made about lack of access. It's not necessarily about equipment or kit. It's about changing rooms and the spaces and the toilets. So where could school staff get guidance on things to consider for provision for those children who might need additional sort of accessibility considerations?
Certainly around kind of changing rooms and toilets, there's an organisation, some of you may have heard of them already because they have made the news quite a few times, especially recently, and that's Changing Places. They focus primarily on public toilets and change rooms across the country, but they certainly, you know, their website is really good, and they would certainly have some advice about maybe some of the equipment that might be useful to help in those spaces to create access. For me, I think Changing Places would be the best source of information.
Thanks. It's just when you were saying about the inter-school competitions and things, I was thinking most individuals, especially at primary, if you have disabled children in primary, you're normally extremely good at catering for the children that you have. But if you're going to take children to events, to competitions, it's making sure that they can get there and access that properly. So that if that Changing Places is the place to look for that information, that's really useful. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think as well, even with Changing Places, potentially for public sporting places, it'd be good to even perhaps chat with them or advocate for public sports places to look at them about coming in to support them on making a space that is really accessible.
Yes. Thank you. The other thing I was going to ask was, you mentioned about busting myths and challenging stereotypes. So what would be some of the practical steps that you'd really like to see primary PE leaders or primary schools taking? They go back into school tomorrow. What are some of the things that you'd like them to start working on?
I think positive representation is always a great start. So if you're going to talk about different sports or different sports people, it's making sure that you're including parasport or Paralympians or para-athletes in those kind of examples that you might be talking about. And there are plenty of sites out there that can support you on that. So, you know, the first and most obvious stop would be the British Paralympic Organisation. Go to their website. You know, they'll have plenty of role models that you could choose from. And I think it's just making sure that there's diversity even in that positive representation. So it's making sure that kids are seing disabled athletes not just in wheelchairs. I think it's worth noting that in the disability community, globally, only 8% of disabled people are wheelchair users. So it's making sure that you're showing a wide variety of different disabilities within the positive representation and role models that you kind of do. I think as well, actually looking at bringing so maybe you have a classroom where you don't have or a class where you don't have a disabled child, but you want to raise awareness about parasport with your non-disabled pupils. It's maybe consider bringing in, I know certainly here locally, I know of there's a guy who comes in and teaches non-disabled kids how to play wheelchair basketball and stuff like that. So it's kind of, again, that thinking outside the box and thinking, who could I get in to come in and maybe either talk about sport, a parasport, or to actually take the kids through a parasport, you know, in person, such as wheelchair basketball.
Thank you. And the point that you made about physical activity being so important for general health as well, and the point about it's not about becoming an elite athlete, it's not necessarily about becoming a competitive sports person, that actually that promotion of movement and activity for general health, I thought was absolutely brilliant, especially alongside the bit that you said about the easy out. So how do we avoid giving children the easy out?
I think it's just it's really having discussions with children and or their parents, because obviously you have to be aware it depends on the age and it depends on the disability, whether you can actually discuss with the child. So, you know, in my situation, someone with my disability, at that age, I would have been happy and I would have these discussions with teachers without necessarily my parents there to advocate for me. But there might be some cases where you have to involve the parents as well. But it's definitely kind of encouraging, I think, encouraging children to have a go. But at the same time, it is also making sure that you are listening to them, because you don't want to cause injury. So or pain in any way. So it's just having that open dialogue with children and being encouraging, I think, at working with them in solving any access issues, or you know, I at the end of Alistair's talk, he was talking about like adjusting games so that, you know, in rugby you're not necessarily going to tackle people, but you might play touch rugby or something where you just tap someone on the back or the shoulder. So it's just like working with the disabled pupils and children on those adaptations and what they're comfortable with. So it's about making the sport comfortable, that they feel confident enough to participate.
That is so succinct. Make it comfortable so that they're confident. I absolutely think that's something that we can definitely take away and start actioning tomorrow. So thank you so much, Liz. I always love listening to you.
Even with the slight tech stress.
It's me, I'm a jinx. And anything I'm ever involved in that involves technology has some kind of weird thing happen to it that's never happened in any history of tech before. So don't fret, it was bound to happen because I'm involved. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And we'll get your slides and we'll put them alongside the recording. So thank you. Have a lovely evening. Thanks for your time, Liz.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.